Welcome back to another episode of the HIT podcast. My name is James Leighton, CEO and founder of Anderson James. This is the podcast where we bring you real-life stories from some of the most interesting leaders of our sector. Today, I was delighted to be joined by Josie Parsons, Chief Executive at Local Space. Local Space are an organisation brought together to provide safe and quality homes for those in need. We talked to Josie about her leadership journey, how she became Chief Executive October 2019, some of her top tips for those wanting to get into leadership, the widening crisis that we have in homelessness, and how we can create more homes for those in need. If you like this episode, I'd ask that you like and subscribe so that we can reach as many people as possible. Enjoy the show. Josie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
Always. As we always start with these things, I've given you an introduction before the show, but just never quite do it justice. So for the purpose of the listeners, can you just give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Certainly, very happy to do that. So I'm actually an accountant by profession, although I work now as a chief executive. So like a lot of accountants, I started my working life in a practice a long time ago. And my career is kind of in three bits, really. So there's the bit that was in practice, there's the bit that was in just commercial business, and then the bit that was that has been in third sector businesses and particularly housing. I've been in housing solely now for probably 10 years, I think. But I did have spells in housing before that as well. I came to Local Space originally as their finance director, and then was lucky enough to be offered the post as chief executive a couple of years ago now. So I'm a couple of years in. Amazing.
And why did you choose the sector? I'm always interested to understand. Was it you fell into it? Did you choose it? What was the rationale behind that call?
Before I came into the sector for the first time, I was working for an insurance broker that was a specialist of the business. So I had a lot of exposure to housing businesses in the round, but from the point of view as a supplier to them. So I was called upon in my job then to do quite a lot of sort of business assessment of housing associations to understand the business model and whether they were successful businesses or not. Mostly they are, luckily. So then I took my first job in housing. And I think for me, housing is where I've settled, because housing and the provision of housing for people is so fundamental to what they need. Everybody needs a home. And this is what we do, in our sector. And I'm really proud of what the sector does for people and how it helps people. And so it feels like housing is where my heart is really now. Well,
nice. I agreed totally. I'm sure there's other sectors we could have chosen, but I love the social value piece and the fact that the purpose of housing is perfect for what I believe in. And Local Space, I know Local Space quite well, but for the listeners, just give us an overview of what the business does, why it was formed, and just so people can understand the differences, that it's not a housing association, but more of a social landlord.
So we are actually a registered social landlord, so we are a housing association, but there are some quite distinct differences between the business model that we run and the typical business model in most housing associations. So we were formed in 2006 with a specific purpose in mind, to help provide a ready supply of good quality housing to help house homeless people in our home local authority area, which is the London Borough of Newham. Mm-hmm. And we were formed initially from a grant of 450 homes. At the time, local authorities weren't able to use the value in the property that they had to leverage in more money to invest in those properties. But housing associations have different rules and had different rules at the time. So we were able at that time to use the value in those 450 homes to both invest in the homes and also to grow by a further 1,000 or so homes in the first instance. And actually, we've continued on that journey over a period of time. And so now Local Space works with 4 key local authorities, and we have just under 3,000 homes in our portfolio now. the London Borough of Newham is still our biggest partner, but we have partnerships with other local authorities as well. And what we provide is what's called intermediate housing, actually. So intermediate housing is where the rent is pitched somewhere in between the market level of rent and social or affordable rent. It's somewhere in between those two areas. But we make sure that all of our rents are affordable within the benefit system, so that if people do find themselves in circumstances where they're claiming benefits, our rents are still affordable using benefits to pay for their rent. So our board are really keen to make sure that our rents are affordable in those terms, and that's how we measure our affordability. So we actually house people from the homeless registers, not the housing register, and that's one of the distinct differences. And that means that we're able to offer assured short hold tenancies to our tenants, but the local authority can then discharge its duty to house people. It's temporary accommodation, but not what you'd think of when you think of temporary. So, you know, temporary accommodation gets a really bad rap, but it's not all the same. So our average tenure length is 6 years. Not temporary by any normal definition.
Yeah. That's amazing.
It's temporary because of the nature of the tenancy. But we don't evict people unless they breach the terms of their tenancy. So we're not like a private landlord might be, where, you know, buying and selling properties and doing all of that. Not that we don't churn properties from time to time, but we wouldn't evict someone to do that. Our tenants are secure in their homes. We say it's settled accommodation. That's what we say we provide. And we also do something else that's a bit different than most housing associations. So our letting standard is very significantly higher than is typically the case. So we refurbish every home when we buy it to an as new standard. We decorate every room, we put flooring in every room, we put curtains at every window, we provide white goods in the kitchen. So when somebody moves into one of our homes, they really can use it as a stepping stone to really start their life in a fundamental way. What you find is that when people come into social housing, they very often have very little by way of possessions at all, and they may just move into one of our homes with the clothes that they have, and they might not have much else at all. So it's really important that you offer somebody something that feels like a home rather than just a shell. We believe that that's really important. Our board are really keen to make sure that we provide something that really does feel like a home, and so we also can offer a furniture package to people if they need it. Not talking about fancy stuff, you know, but the basics, so that people have beds to sleep on, they've got a sofa to sit on, they've got a table and chairs where they can, you know, sit with their kids and have a meal. And it's family accommodation that we provide by and large. Very little single person accommodation, mostly families. So homeless families, very important to be housing homeless families.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does that, more of an education point for myself, but how does that process work? So, because clearly people think of homelessness, and I know we're going to talk about this at length, but people think of homelessness and they think rough sleepers and they think people on the street. But if someone knows that they're going to become homeless, how does that process work for them as a family? Do they sign up to the register and then you get notified, or how does that process link together?
So if you are a family facing homelessness, or actually having been evicted and be actually homeless, then you would turn up at your local authority and to the housing function, and all being well, they would accept a duty to house you, whether you're actually homeless or whether you're at risk of homelessness. The local authority has a duty to prevent homelessness. That's actually a really important duty of local authorities. They maintain a homeless register, and then if we have a property that's available, we notify the local authority that that property is available and the date from which it's available, and they provide us with a nomination from their homeless register, and then we go through the process of sign up and enabling the person to move into our homes. There's no further assessment that we do, so we're not editing out anyone that comes through, because people are homeless, they need a home, and that's what we're here to do. That's our function.
And does it work in the same way as the housing register? Because I'm presuming that, you know, looking at the numbers and the statistics of homelessness recently that I've read, that there's going to be more and more people thrown into this situation. So how does the local authority then edit or dictate who gets that home, because there's not enough homes for the amount of people homeless, is there? So how does that work?
No, so on their housing register, they will have criteria to grade people, I guess you'd say, according to their need. So the sorts of things that most local authorities will look at will be things like overcrowding, will be things like disability or other illnesses of that sort. Some local authorities have a priority or preference for ex-military people who find themselves in housing difficulty. It depends where you are. Each local authority, though, has its own criteria that it uses, its own grading mechanism. And if you are waiting for housing on the housing register, then there's a bidding process that you would need to normally go through. Most local authorities participate in one or other of those. The homeless register is slightly different in the sense that the homeless register are people who are actually homeless or at risk of homelessness. So they are considered to be an urgent need rather than just waiting for the normal process to get to the top of the list, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, there are criteria that are applied. And so priority homelessness would be something like somebody fleeing domestic violence, maybe. Somebody that's got children will normally be a priority. So the difference is that these are people in acute housing need rather than chronic, I guess you'd say, housing need. It's all housing need, though.
It is all housing need, and we'll come on to how we're going to tackle that. But then, so I get a home with local space. What happens then? Because clearly, homelessness is complex. I'm not saying it all complex, but broadly speaking, it's complex. What happens to the care of that family when they get into their accommodation in local space? Does that go back to the local authority, or do you pick that up as a business?
We pick up the assessment side of that. So we have a look at any new tenant coming into one of our properties to see whether they have any other needs or a packet of needs, whether that's social services, whether that's debt support or advice, whatever that might be. Whilst we don't provide all of that support ourselves, we very much signpost and enable the individual to access that support that they may need. It's a little bit different than the situation of somebody who's a street homeless person, and we'll talk about that, I think, a bit more later. So it is slightly different, but you do find that there are some of the same kinds of needs, and making sure that people can access healthcare when they need it, and social care support if they need it, and also things like domestic violence, of course. Fleeing domestic violence bring very particular needs and requirements around from the point of view of safety.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you get involved in the safety elements? Because clearly that's a big part of it, isn't it, from a domestic violence? And then they move into the property, and then do you operate, broadly speaking, as a housing association, i.e., you look after rent and arrears and all the things as usual? I presume it works exactly the same, does it, from that perspective?
Absolutely. There's no particular difference there. We do have a portfolio of homes that are managed by the London Borough of Newham on our behalf at the moment, although they're in transition and moving back to us. And you mean from a repairs and a refurbishment and that sort of voids perspective? Yeah. So the repairs functions actually already come back to us, but the housing management still rests with Newham at the moment for a portfolio of our homes, but they're moving back the year after next in 2020.
Okay. And from your point, I presume this will grow because naturally, as the problem widens, your portfolio will need to widen to support. Have you got any ambition for local space to go into other areas, or is it going to be a very tight-knit community in terms of the Southeast, do you think, in the future?
Well, we're always up for a challenge, that's for sure. We've got some ambition for some modest growth over the next 2 or 3 years in the business, but there are other opportunities that that come our way from time to time that we will always have a look at and explore to see whether it's something that we can do, assist or help with, particularly when one of our partners approaches us with a particular need. Then we'll always look at that. The board are really clear that any opportunity of that nature needs to be properly assessed and considered to see whether it fits with our business, whether it fits in our business plan financially, but also whether it's something that we are able to do, because we can't be all things to all people, but if we can help with something, if we feel like we have the skills and the knowledge to help with something, then of course we will do if we can afford to do it, because there's never been more need and it's not going anywhere.
No, agree. And before we get on to that, I suppose a couple of other things I was thinking on local spaces. How does it get funded? I mean, obviously rents, but I mean, the ideal scenario is you'd want to build more houses, you'd want to refurb, you'd want to do more with what you've got. But how does the financing work behind a business like yours when you need to invest in things? Like, does it just come from rent, or do you get some government help? How does all that work?
The fundamental business is a successful one from a financial perspective. So the rent less the costs gives us a reasonable margin. So we have some funding available to reinvest in our business every year, just purely from that. But it's not normally enough to do enough of what we want to do by way of either acquiring and refurbishing additional properties, or indeed investing in the properties that we have over a period of time. So we leverage the value in our properties to borrow money from various sources. We've got 5 funding partners at the moment. 2 of them are private placement type funding. And the rest is bank funding of one kind or another. Our board like the balance between fixed rate and floating rate, more fixed than floating rate, which is obviously really good at the moment because rates are rising. So if you fix it, then you fix your costs, and so it gives you more predictability. But it's very much a long-term decision that we make in terms of investment. So we've got a big investment program at the moment, two elements to it. There's the normal decent home stuff, and of course that's a moving target because there's going to be a new standard, but we're working with what we have. But we're also doing a carbon reduction investment program over the next few years as well, which is mostly about the fabric of the buildings. So it's insulation for the most part.
EWI, okay. And it's fascinating. And how many, just to talk numbers, I suppose, how many residents, how many or tenants, and how many properties have you currently got in your portfolio as a business?
We've got about 2,000, just less than 2,800 at the moment. Properties in our portfolio. A proportion of those are let to the London Borough of Newham for their use as temporary accommodation. 1,450 of them are, so it's roughly half. And the other half are our local space tenants at the moment. There are likely to be some changes in what that looks like over the next few years, but that's how things are right now. We're aiming to grow by around 50 to 80 over the next 3 years. That's the plan. And our growth isn't by building, by and large, although we'll look at opportunities if they come our way that are suitable. It's more acquisition and refurbishment. But what we've also done on some occasions is buy a group of properties in a block from a developer where they need a bit of cash flow, because we can, we're a cash buyer. So, if you're buying 10, you might get a discount. That works really well for us. We can turn those around really quickly within a couple of weeks. We just do the landlord stuff, and then those can be let. So that's actually quite good. We've been able to do that on a few occasions.
Yeah, I think I was saying to you just offline, I've been in the market a long time now, and I've seen temporary accommodation come on tenfold from where it was 10 years. I mean, literally, it was, it was a poor quality of housing at that stage. And now, like, I looked at your website and the type of properties you let, you'd be hard pushed to see the differences between those properties and any property, wouldn't you? Really, they're great standard, and I suppose that's credit to your business, but also credit to the fact that the market's moved on a lot since 10, 12, 15 years ago, in my opinion. But acquisition, I like that you say that, because I feel like the whole world is centered around new build. And if you read the stats about how many vacant properties there are in the world at the moment, I mean, we're not even making the best use of the things we've got, are we, at this stage? So
I think that's right. And I think one of the things that's really good about local space is that we will buy properties that maybe another investor wouldn't want to buy because they require money spending on them. That doesn't worry us. We're quite content with the idea of investing in properties as long as they haven't got fundamental structural problems.
Of course.
We're happy enough to do the larger scale investment, because it's all about the long term gains that you get from the long term income stream from property. It's not a short term capital gain that we're looking for in the way that other investors might So that's less of an issue for us than it would be for others. New build is fantastic, though, and is necessary.
Of course.
It's just not what we're currently doing.
Yeah, and of course, and most of my world centres around new build housing at the moment, as you'd expect. But I just see so much derelict property, and you think we've got to start thinking about how we can reutilise some of that when you see the growing homelessness problem that we've got in the country. So, and on local space, then I've noticed that you're still building your team, and you have been building your team, and you've built a brilliant board of directors, and I've seen that, and you've got loads of good, knowledgeable people in your board. How have you found that journey of kind of scaling up the business over the last 5-10 years? Because it's interesting that it does operate like a normal housing association, and it's scaling up. But how have you found recruiting staff? How have you found getting people bought into the journey? Because it's a beautiful story to tell, isn't it? But I presume the type of person you go and try and recruit are those that are, heart first and career second, because clearly they'll want to come in because of the right reasons, won't they?
Well, I certainly hope so. I'll talk about board first, and then staff, if that's okay. So board recruitment's actually been quite straightforward for us, in the sense that we've had a lot of interest in our board when we've advertised for. So the last time we did board recruitment, we were recruiting for 2 posts on our board, and we had over 200 applications, which was massive. Massive. It's because I think part of the reason that we get so many applications for our board is because it's a really interesting business, and it's a bit of a different business model. And so people are interested in understanding that, and also feeling like they're making a real difference for people who are homeless. So really at the sharp end of acute homelessness. So it's been very straightforward for us to recruit board members, and you will have seen that we've got a chair who's been in post since 2020, who's absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
So we've got really good skills on our board, and we're very particular. So if we're looking for particular skills, then we're very clear about that. We've also got a really good diverse board as well, in terms of gender, in terms of other measures as well, and that's really really important for us.
Definitely.
On the staff side, we have some of the same difficulties that all housing associations experience in terms of recruitment. There are certain types of skills that are quite hard to recruit to. So we recognise certain posts within our business that tend to be hard to recruit. There might be things with surveying skills, for example, that can be quite difficult. IT skills can also be quite difficult to recruit. But we try to make sure that it's really clear what we're looking for when we're recruiting to local space, because local space is a smaller business, and sometimes there's a perception that a smaller business means a simpler business, and I don't think that's the case at all, actually, because what we need from people are actually broader skills. And we need people to be not afraid to cross over and look at some other part of the business if we need resource in that part of the business, and that doesn't suit everybody, and that's okay. What's important is that we make sure that it's really clear what we're looking for and why we're looking for it. And we've also had some reasonable success with temp to perm type recruitment as well, where we get a really good opportunity to assess someone in post, and they also get the opportunity to see whether it's the right environment for them. And if it's not, that's okay. But if it is, it's fantastic, and we're then able to make that permanent. We also invest a fair bit in training and development for people, so trying to grow our own a bit. That's also a really good way of moving things through. We've had some success with internal appointments in certain posts, but we always do that against external candidates. So we need to make sure that we are able to recruit.
You're benchmarking, and it's fascinating, and it's not something I ask at the end, but we might as well, because we're talking about it. But we've got a long way as a housing sector to go to generate the next wave of talented individuals to come into the market, and we do loads around diversity, and especially up in the north, in some of the areas where there's not as much black talent in some of the local areas. Well, we've got to start creating some talent some diverse talent that we can utilise in other roles. And I think a lot of the times housing associations at the moment are getting much better at bringing that talent in. And I think it's because, if you look at the new generation of talent that I meet all the time, they want social purpose, they want sustainability, they want to look at net zero carbon, and actually the market's become much more interesting than it used to be, you know, bricks and mortar. What do you think the answer is to bring in the next generation of talent in, and what do you think we can do to combat that as a sector?
I think it's really important to have those training and development opportunities for people. So have really clear training programs so that you can get people early on in their career and show them what housing is all about and how exciting and interesting and also valuable it is as a role. So being able to bring in apprentices or graduate trainees, I think, is a really great thing to do. And I think also there's a bigger picture piece out there about telling our story a bit more. I'm not scared to tug on the heartstrings. I'm really not, because what we do is really important and makes a massive difference in people's lives. So actually being clear and telling that story in a really appealing way, in a way that grabs people and makes them interested in exploring what the opportunities might be in our sector. You're never going to be short of job satisfaction when you work in housing. I agree. That's for sure.
Yeah. And look, and the sector's more progressive than it's ever been. You could have argued previously that it stagnated in early 2010. I think it stagnated slightly. But I think now digital transformation, change, all these things that are taking place, it's fascinating to see what the next journey looks like, because we've got to engage customers, tenants, residents in a different way than we used to. And that's going to be an interesting challenge for everyone to fix. Final thing on local space, where are you seeing the main challenges for the business at the moment, and what do you think the challenges you're likely to face are going to be in the future?
Well, there's the challenge around rising inflation, of course. So that has some particular implications for us, because whereas most housing associations have their rent linked to inflation as well as their costs, most of our rent is governed by contracts that don't include inflation in quite the same way. So there's a difference, therefore, in terms of what the amount by which costs are going up compared to prices, which gives us a bit of a squeeze. So that is a challenge for us. Interest rate rises for the sector as a whole are definitely a challenge for the future. You can manage that, and I would still say that even 2% base rates are very low. Really? It's just we haven't seen them for a long time, that's all. So we will have to get used to an environment where the costs are a bit different than they have been. So those are definite challenges. We've got a lot of supply challenges for our repairs contractors. Everybody has. So the price of some raw materials has risen massively in this last year. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's about coming out of the pandemic and that sort of thing. Some of it's about Brexit here, of course. Some of it's about other prices rising. So because fuel costs have gone up so much, of course, transporting stuff is much more expensive. So those are all very significant risks. But actually, in the staffing area, that's going to be a massive challenge for us. For the first time, the government have released statistics that say that there are more vacancies than there are people looking for work. Yeah. That's going to be an issue.
And we are feeling that. And it's interesting because the private sector, I've obviously seen cyclical waves of this over my career, but what happens is people, ironically chase, opportunity, careers, money, those things, and clearly they can find that in the private sector. And then when the private sector slows down, they come back to the public sector. And I feel that there's a wave of that every time that there's a recession or an inflation problem. But even if you just look at the housing landscape, the local authorities, we're all fighting for the same people on a daily basis. And I don't know how that's going to fix itself, if I'm being honest, especially development skills, property services skills, asset management skills. They're just in such crazy demand. And then if you look at building safety, that's brand new, everyone's looking for the same role, to be honest.
Building safety is a massive challenge, both in terms of actually getting the assessment work done, but also actually delivering any work that needs to be done. I mean, we've had real issues with fire door availability.
As is everyone. You're not alone. Yeah, you're not alone.
Massive issue.
There's plenty of challenges there. And as we look at homelessness as a topic then, so the type, like you said, the people that you deal with are on the homeless register. I think when anyone thinks of homelessness, they think on the street, rough sleeping, as we said previously, but there's the hidden homelessness. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I know we talked about this offline, but what does that mean, and how many do you think that's roughly affecting in the UK, would you say?
Well, homelessness is much larger than what you see on the streets, and even the measures that are taken, I think it's in November every year, where they do a snapshot to look at what is people who are on the streets. Even that number is a massive undercount, but there are estimated to be something like 8.5 million people with unmet housing need of one kind or another. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily homeless right now, but it might mean that they're in unsuitable housing of one kind or another. I've got some really good data around this. There's around about 4.2 million people for whom social housing of those 8.5 million would be most appropriate, and there's just nowhere near enough for that. Yeah. And this is around 500,000 more than are on the official waiting lists. So, and overcrowding affects 3.7 million people, 2 million children.
Wow.
Massive numbers. And all of that's really a massive issue in London and elsewhere, but especially in London. But really, I would say that whilst homelessness is probably a symptom, the cause is actually poverty. Poverty is really at the root of why we have this as an issue. And around about a quarter of households in the UK are below what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation calls the minimum income standard. That's the level at which you can afford to have a reasonable standard of living. Yeah. So more than a quarter of all households in the UK are below that standard. That's staggering and really, really scary, I think. And 25% of UK children live in very, very low income households. It's not great. So it's a really massive thing. And even in 2022, in the 5th richest country in the world, we even have destitution. Destitution exists. And that's really scary, because destitution is a whole different level of poverty. Yeah. And it's estimated to affect 2.4 million people in the UK, 550,000 children.
How has it got so bad? I mean, I wonder what those numbers would have been 7-10 years ago. I wouldn't have a clue, but I mean, they're rising, aren't they?
They are rising. They reached a lower point in 2010, and they've been rising since then. There are a number of reasons for this. You'll be aware, of course, that wage inflation has been very low over the longer term. So people's income hasn't necessarily kept up with the cost of living particularly well. And in certain sectors, that's been especially bad. Interestingly, a lot of those sectors are ones that are paid for by the government, where they've had restrictions at 1% on pay rises and that kind of thing. So, none of that helps. We've also had all of the changes in the welfare benefit system that have happened in the last 10, 12 years, which have marginalised and reduced the eligibility that people have to claim benefits. So if you're claiming full benefits now, if you're eligible for full benefits, it's been reducing over a period of time. So if it reduces in actual pound terms, then the proportion, the sort of real effect of that is much greater even. So it pushes people into an even lower level of poverty. And the shift away from the traditional benefits to universal credit has been particularly difficult, because it's broken the link to some extent between the cost of housing specifically and benefits. In the old system, housing benefit was very specific and was about housing and was linked to housing. It's been extremely difficult for us as a housing association to understand within universal credit what element of that is related to housing. It's supposed to be related to housing, but it's really hard to see. It's not very visible. It's very difficult to get transparency around that. So if you are entitled to benefits, you're living on a very low level of income, and you're trying to raise your family, and that's become much more difficult over a period of time. So I feel like there's a kind of perfect storm, if you like. So you have all of that going on in people's income, and then housing costs generally have been rising.
Yeah, no.
And rent levels have gone up massively.
And what can we do to get people into, because homelessness for me is not just about the home. That's the critical part. I get that. Okay. But then what do we do to, like you said, your business is the perfect tonic to giving someone a stepping stone to their future. I met an individual, we do a lot of work with the Booth Centre, which is a homeless charity up in Manchester. And I met an individual that was a finance director 12, 18 months ago, falling out of his way, things had gone wrong, all these sorts of things. And actually, when I reflected on the story, I was thinking, how could we take that group of people that I've met and reskill, retrain, do something to get them back into employment? Because not all were, some were employed, but we just talked about the fact there's more jobs than there are people with skills. But how do we increase the ability for us to retrain people so that they can go and get suitable employment and they can rebuild their lives? Because at the moment, it feels like we solved the housing part, but we still wouldn't solve the ultimate goal, which is to get those people back into a happy place of living.
I think that's a really tough nut to crack, because we still have this perception that life is a single career. That's not necessarily the case. It's quite common for people to change career and to change what kind of work they do during the course of their life. That might be because the world has changed and the job becomes obsolete, but it also might be that the person has changed and is no longer able to do or no longer wants to do something that they had previously done. There are some really good examples of initiatives for specific groups of people to help them to retrain. So if you look at what the armed forces do when people leave the armed forces, there's a lot of support and help for people to help them to make the transition into civilian life, because that can be really tough for people leaving the armed forces. To normalise the fact that transition and change happens in people's lives and careers. For me, that's part of it, I think. There's also an issue around stigma, and there's an issue around age as well, of course. So if you find yourself in circumstances where you need to retrain or do a different job in later life, that can be very much harder because there is a perception that people can't change when they're older. And I don't think that's true. But if enough people believe that to be true, then it can be very hard for people to get on. So you find that sometimes people who maybe they're made redundant in their late 50s or later, they find it really difficult to then get another job. And I think that's something that we probably need to deal with. But being welcoming and accepting and welcoming people who are changing career and accepting that is okay to do that, and it's normal to do that, because it is.
Of course it is. And, we do a lot around apprenticeships and graduates, and I'm seeing more mature apprentices than ever before. Yeah. And that's not because they're in a difficult situation. They decide they wanted to change their career path. But the stigma attached to mature apprentices is insane. Oh no, we wouldn't look at someone at that age. Why? Because well, they wouldn't be able to change and the things that you've just said, and that's not the case. I don't believe that's the case at all.
I don't believe it's the case either, and so I think it's about changing some of those perceptions. Having said all of that, for a mature person to do an apprenticeship with the level of wages that you get paid on an apprenticeship,
tough, isn't it?
It's got to be tough.
But that's someone deciding they want to do something to better themselves. And we haven't really got the infrastructure as a country, I don't believe, to make that transition comfortable for someone. And you look at, you mentioned it previously, IT skills. We're desperate for IT skills across the country. But to retrain the amount of people we'd need to retrain to deal with the need, we'd need to do something more encouraging to those people to retrain. It's like tradesmen, interestingly. Yeah. People aren't coming out of school like they used to and going into apprenticeships and then creating a trade for themselves because it's not seen as desirable anymore because the money's not enough. So there's a whole host of things that need fixing. One thing you mentioned, which sort of has got me thinking, is you get someone nominated from the local authority, you then house them. The awful side of that is we know there's not enough homes for the amount of people on the register. Yeah. What happens to the people that don't get housed? What happens to the list of people that can't get housed and they're out of house? What is the solution there?
Well, local authorities like the London Borough of Newham that we work with use all possible options to house people from their homeless register. So There will be some people on their homeless register who are offered a local space home, but there will also be some who are offered a home in the private sector. And there will be some who are in much more unpleasant forms of temporary accommodation, at least for a period of time. In an ideal world, local space and similar wouldn't be necessary, but it is. So all local authorities are using all possible options. What's great about local space is that number one, it's a much better quality home, and it's also a much more secure home than other forms of housing that might be available. But also number two, it's a regulated home, and it's in their local authority area. So they're not being moved to somewhere miles and miles away. To Hull or somewhere. Not that there's any problem living in Hull, but if your family are in Newham, Hull's got to be quite difficult, hasn't it? You know, I'm sure that Hull is a lovely place to live. If your family are there, fantastic. But you know, it's not great when people are moved a long way from all of their networks. That's a really big issue for people. But I think from the local authority's perspective, we save the local authority around 20% of cost. So their homeless costs come from their general fund, not their housing fund, not the HRA. So come from the general fund. So we save them money. And also deliver a better quality product, a more secure product for the homeless people.
And if I'm Newham, as an example, would I not work in partnership with you to create more houses? Because clearly, like, if you could solve this problem, you go from 2,000 properties to 20,000 properties, and all of a sudden, problem solved. Now I know it's not that straightforward, but what is the solution to us creating more needed homes? And I know that this is a big problem in the housing market anyway, but how do we create more homes for those people that need them? Well,
the National Housing Federation estimate that 300,000 homes per year are what is required. That's the number. We're nowhere near that. And we need homes of all types of tenure. We also need to be not selling them off either. So right to buy, not the best idea, really.
Yeah, agree, totally.
One for one replacement through right to buy is fundamentally an issue. And it remains to be seen whether that's actually possible. That's what the government is saying is going to happen, but we don't know what that's going to look like yet. So that's sort of going against the tide, which is not great. It depends on where you are. So in London in particular, the availability and the cost of land is massive. So that is an issue. So build costs are an issue. If you're building new properties, we do need to build more properties. Absolutely, we do. But we also need to utilise what's there and utilise it effectively and appropriately. That's one of the things that we do. So we're not building by and large. We are buying properties from the market and bring them back into use. Some of the properties need a lot of money spending on them, and that's fine. We're happy to do that, but not all investors would be. So for us, that works fine. We need all options to be considered, and modular homes is one of the newer things that is happening. It's not new in the world particularly, but it's relatively new in the UK. There are some planning issues, so there's a lot of NIMBYism. So we all know that more housing is required, but nobody wants it where they are. Well, it's got to go somewhere. So
it really does.
It really needs to be there, to be built. And it's also really important that when local authorities are giving planning consent for new homes, that they also plan the infrastructure that's needed so that people can live appropriately where they are. So, doctor surgeries, schools, shops, all that stuff. And also making sure the road networks can cope. All those kinds of things are really important. It's a coordinated approach that I think is missing in the UK. There are some examples elsewhere in the world of a much more coordinated approach to planning, long-term planning, like in Sweden, for example. And if we were able to take some of those kinds of lessons and apply them here, I think that would be really, really positive. In Sweden, it still takes a long time to get planning consent, but when you get planning consent, you've got everything in place. All of the infrastructure.
Planning is, I've done 30, 40 episodes of our podcast, and I reckon planning's come up in every single one. It's broken.
Planning is not a great system. It isn't great. And the government have pledged to do something about it, but they put forward a proposal and then withdrew it. So we still don't quite know where that's.
And the irony of the whole situation of what we've talked about on this podcast so far is they haven't got enough resource either. So it's absolutely just broken, and I don't think anyone wants to take hold of it because they don't know how to fix it. So it's going to be a difficult situation, that. But
what I'd love to see is for housing to be taken out of the political arena altogether and to be really firmly placed in the infrastructure bucket, so that it was not a political football in the way that it has been in the last.
Totally agree, and you've got to say, and I don't ever get political on the podcast, but you've got to say we've got some uncertainty. It would be the nicest way of putting it coming, because they're going to be kicking it around now for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. And we're going to get the brunt of that as an industry, aren't we? To be honest.
Well, yes, uncertainty is never a good thing. Whatever the cause of it is never a good thing. It's always problematic, because at the very least it means there's just no decisions being taken at all, so things just stop. It could be worse than that, but yes, you're absolutely right, and we're facing the probability of another election in a couple of years, aren't we? So short-term planning is all that's going to be.
That's it.
Really possible. And that's just not great. That's why I say putting it into the bucket of infrastructure and thinking about it in a much long-term way, the way we think about rail lines, the way we think about airports. That makes far more sense to me, because then you can plan things in the longer term. And it means that those organisations, all the building companies who have to plan in the long term and deliver, they have a bit more certainty as to what to expect. And longer term certainty is better.
Okay. Yeah, of course, and I agree with you. And if we could take out the political arena, we'd have a little bit more stability in the decision making.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up, a couple of things I just wanted to ask you. One is, if you were Prime Minister or you were running government, what would be the one thing that you'd change about the housing sector to make it better in the future? And the second point, and more towards what you're doing at the moment, what would you do to try and fix the housing crisis? If you just could implement two things, what would they be?
To fix the housing crisis, I would probably be going down putting it into the infrastructure bucket, actually, so that you had cross-party support for initiatives and decisions that were being taken. Then you don't get the flip-flopping of decisions, and it means that you can actually make measured progress over the longer term, because that's what's required: long-term planning and progress. In terms of housing specifically, what one thing would I change? I don't know. I think probably I would want us as a sector to accept that we don't always get it right. And that's a fact. And so we acknowledge and accept that we don't always get it right, but we do everything we possibly can to put things right when they've gone wrong for somebody, because nobody should be living in those conditions that have been very much publicised on ITV in the last year or so. Nobody should be being expected to live in those conditions.
Sure. And just on homelessness, the final point, what would be your best thing you could do now, or what would the best thing the government could do to support people that are in that situation? What can we do to fix that issue?
Well, I think there's sort of multiple parts to that. So I don't think there's a silver bullet.
No, agree.
But money is the big thing that is needed to help with this. Now, whether that's money for supporting individuals to improve their lives, like something like the Housing First initiatives that are being piloted in the UK. So, that requires money to support that for individuals, and a tailored support package for an individual that addresses their particular needs. For sure, that would be really helpful. But actually, investment in building new homes, so the grant system, we've had our grant levels squeezed over the years. And the more you squeeze the grant levels, the less homes are being delivered. So that is, and that's a long-term investment. It's not a short-term investment. So for me, it's the balance between short-term money that's needed and long-term investment that's needed. And I don't think we've quite got the balance right.
No, I agree. I think everyone would agree with that point. And the final couple of things. One, and I get asked this every time I interview someone. What What advice would you give someone that's budding to become a chief exec or a leader in an organisation? Because clearly you've had a really good career development and journey, but actually not traditional in any way, shape or form, finance into practice, into public sector, into private to public. What tips would you give to someone that wants to get to that leadership role and things that they can do in their career to make that happen for themselves?
I think I would probably recommend that people build transferable skills.
Yeah.
And take opportunities that come their way, even if they feel like they're a bit left field. Because there's no experience that you can have that's not valuable in some way or another, even if it tells you something you don't want to do.
Agree.
Really good to try out different things. So if you get the opportunity to participate in projects, do that. Absolutely do that. If you get the opportunity for a secondment into a different team to do a different type of work, then do that. It's all really good learning, even if it only shows you something you don't like or you don't want to do. It's really good to do that. And don't pigeonhole yourself too early in your career either. I think that's a mistake. I think
it's really good feedback. I love that. I read a lot of self-development books, and I would say that like saying yes to things is always going to end up in a better spot. Even if the bad lessons, good lessons, you learn something from every experience. So I really like that. And just to wrap up, and a final thing, local space in the next 3-5 years, what's really important to you and the board for the next couple of years?
The really important things for us, we've got our strategic plan, which we're in the middle of delivering. It's really important that we deliver all of the things that we aim to deliver in our strategic plan, whilst not being afraid to tweak and change that as the world moves and changes. So I think that's really important for us. And I think embracing and really getting to grips with the consumer regulation and what that's going to mean for us in the future. So doing better for our customers, how important that is. We really need to do that. We should have been doing it anyway, actually.
Fair. That is fair. But I mean, honestly, fascinating story. Like, you've got a fantastic business, and it's really inspiring to hear people doing such good work in their communities and stuff. And I think local space will go on to do great things. And I hope in 5-6 years we pick up again and we can talk about where you've got to in the next 5 or 6 years. But thank you for taking the time out to talk to us, and really appreciate it. I'm sure people get great value from that.
Thanks, James. It's been really great to be with you and to talk to you.